Again, welcome everybody to a webinar on managing your forest with climate change in mind. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Ali Kosiba. I'm Assistant Professor of Forestry at UVM Extension. And this is a project that I've been working on in conjunction with Vermont Woodlands Association, who's sort of the host of this, Forest Parks and Recreation out of Vermont, the Tree Farm program, and it was funded through a grant through the Open Space Institute. I'm going to be talking about ways that landowners can consider climate change when they're thinking about forest management and forest stewardship. And we'll have time at the end for questions. And just, I think everyone is muted here, but just a reminder, keep muted as you can. So the climate is bringing more change, it's changing, it's bringing more uncertainty to the future conditions of our forests. So we know things like we're experiencing fewer cold winter nights. This is an example of our, if you're a gardener, farmer, our plant hardiness zones have changed. And those are really determined by the coldest minimum winter temperatures we experience. So those have altered. We're not experiencing quite as cold temperatures as we used to historically. We're seeing a longer growing season. It's a little bit outdated, this graphic here, but it's about 3 weeks longer growing season than we had, in the turn of the 19th century. We're seeing other kind of strange weather patterns like more ice storms, more heavy wet snow when we go from frozen precipitation to wet precipitation when the temperature's warm. And we're certainly seeing more heavy rainfall. So these rainfall events, 1, 2 inches, 3 inches in rain. And what happens is that rain comes down so fast, so much, it generally doesn't have the opportunity to absorb into the soil. So we have what we call overland flow, can cause erosion, runoff, losses of nutrients and carbon from the forest, and certainly it can affect water quality. But we also are seeing more variability when it rains. So we might have more heavy rainfall some periods, but then longer stretches of time when we don't have as much rain. And we've seen that, and drought is something we experience here in the Northeast. But the concern is that we'll have longer droughts and more frequent. So summer after summer, we could see droughts. And this is an example of a drought monitor on the right, and this is the current condition. And we might think we've gotten a lot of rain, but because we had a low snowpack this year, those losses of water, we haven't reached the full amount of water we'd have over a long time frame. So we do have to look at long time frames when we consider these changes in our weather patterns. And it's important to note that these observed changes are not uniform throughout the state. So we have things like higher elevation locations are seeing larger increases in temperature compared to the lower elevation locations. We're seeing things like rainfall patterns are really variable across our state because of our topography, our mountain ranges, our weather patterns. And certainly places like north-facing slopes, what we call cold air drainages. So these are just natural topographic features that sort of bring down cold air from up high, are possible, we call climate refugia. So they are sort of places that are a little bit more buffered from these rapid changes in climate. And so, we think about Vermont's landscape, the majority, over almost 80% of our forests are privately owned, mostly by family forest owners, individual forest owners. And so that means that, all of us have an important role to play when we think about our forests here in Vermont. We do know we have quite a lot of forest cover in Vermont. We're very proud of that, about 73%, but we are seeing losses of forest cover over time. So, as a landowner, it's really, important to recognize that we can all make decisions to include climate change in our management. And we can do this and reduce what we call vulnerabilities to climate change and other stressors, and actually advance the resilience of our woods in the future. So when we talk about vulnerabilities, it's the degree to which a forest is susceptible and unable to recover from climate change. And so certain conditions in your woods can make your forest stands, your woods, more or less vulnerable to climate change impacts. So I'll talk about what those are, but really recognizing the specific vulnerabilities that each forest stand has can help inform management decisions moving forward. And really the goal here is resilience. It's the ability of a forest to recover or adapt following some disturbance, change that might be due to climate change, could be due to other stressors that we experience in our state. So we worked on this, what we call 12 steps to climate resilience. And it's really a guide for landowners that want to start thinking about incorporating climate change into how they think about their forests and their land. So the first of these is really basic, simple, but it's really probably one of the most critical, getting to know your land. And so especially if you're a new landowner, but even if you've owned your land for a while, it's really, having this lens of climate change when you walk through your woods can really help you sort of look and understand different aspects of your forest. We know that climate change will affect different forests, different stands, different species differently due to the land use history, the past management, maybe you did or a different, previous landowners did. We've learned a lot about forest management over the last 100 years, and we do things very differently than we did, in the turn of the 19th century and 20th century. And we incorporate a lot more ecology into our work now. So sometimes there was mismanagement on our land, things like high grading, taking out the best trees, taking out certain species has left an effect of species diversity on the land. And there are certainly different disturbances that happen across the landscape. So things like wind, insects, diseases can hit different forests in different ways. We certainly have stressors like deer browse, invasive species that aren't uniform across our state. And then just things like site characteristics. What kind of soils are there? How moist is it? What's the topography like? What's the aspect like? How high is it? Those are all unique to each forest. So we get these resulting different site conditions, different what we call forest structure. That's sort of the arrangement of trees, the tree sizes, the species in our forest, the vigor. So that's sort of like the health and productivity, how fast the trees grow, how old they are, soil conditions, nutrients in the soil. All sorts of things can be affected by past management, disturbances, and stressors that those forests might experience. So first, can be as simple of getting to know your woods, what features, the current conditions. If you have a forest management plan by a consulting forester, that's a great place to start because usually there is a map in there. It's usually one of the first things foresters do, make a map, get to know the land. If you have a forester come out, they're going to be doing exactly that. You can walk with them. You can do this yourself. And, mark things that you find significant, but things you really want to pay attention to: water bodies, streams, sort of unique topographic features, steep slopes, certainly any place you have roads and trails, even ones that you're not using. So old roads, old trails, sources of erosion are really important to identify and mark. Sort of delineating different forest types or species, areas where you see sort of older trees, younger trees, and certainly things like invasive plants or signs of animal browse on plants is really good to delineate, to sort of understand the patterns and the impact of those stressors. So the second of these is connecting with a licensed forester. And many of you might already do this and have a licensed forester. If you're enrolled in the current use program here in Vermont, that is a requirement to work with a consulting forester. All foresters that work in the state of Vermont must be licensed. And it's a pretty in-depth endeavor. You have to have an educational background, take a test, and do continuing education every year. I'm a licensed forester, and it is, it allows us to keep up with the current science and the current best practices for forestry. So things like including climate change in management is part of what we do with this continuing education. And so a forester really can help you if you're sort of, you can start this process yourself, but a forester can really help you sort of have that lens when you're walking through the woods, help you identify some of those health concerns so you can increase resilience. And if you're not sure who to talk to, in Vermont, we have the Forest Parks and Recreation County Foresters, which are an incredible resource, and they will provide a free consult regardless of your parcel size. So if you're not enrolled in the current use program, if you have smaller than 25 acres, that's fine. You can reach out to your county forester. And if you don't know who your county forester is, could just a reminder, if everyone could please mute their speakers, that'd be great. If you don't know who to reach out to, you can go to this URL on the FPR website, and they have a list of each county's county forester and their phone numbers and emails to reach out to. And they're wonderful people, very knowledgeable and helpful. So the really kind of the big part of this practice is knowing your woods and then identifying the vulnerabilities as specific to your parcel. So doing this, considering vulnerabilities to climate change, weather events, insects, diseases, other stressors will allow you to then figure out the management practices that would best help you advance the resilience and reduce those vulnerabilities. And really walking your woods with a forester is sort of the best way to do this. But you can do this, with friends, neighbors, family members too, and start looking and trying to identify some of these characteristics. But it is really critical, for long-term planning. If we think about our forests, we want them to be forests in the future. Many of us have land for an investment, for family reasons to pass on, and really doing this ensures that long-term sustainability of your forest. So I break these down into sort of 3 buckets of vulnerabilities just to help folks think about this. And I'll go into each one of these in a little bit more detail, but sort of the conditions that could affect regeneration, so the future forest. And then second of these are conditions that affect the mature overstory trees. And these are conditions that might suggest that they are less resilient, less healthy to disturbance events and extreme events. And the third is one we often don't think about because we look at the trees, but are conditions of the forest that affect soils and water quality. And so the first of these that affect tree regeneration, the future forest, are things like invasive plants, particularly populations that are expanding in size, or things like extensive animal browse on seedlings and saplings. And I will say this is a very big issue in New England and in Vermont. We have, in some areas of our state, we have a lot of deer browse. Up in the Northeast Kingdom, sometimes more moose browse and deer browse. But regardless, these animals can really, take a big chunk out of our regenerating class. So those are our seedlings and our saplings. And when our seedlings and saplings don't have a lot of leaves or buds on them, and then when they get browse, it can cause mortality. And so when we, see really big pressures from deer browse, it can result in what we call regeneration failure, where there just isn't any seedlings and saplings in the understory because of heavy deer pressure. There can be other reasons why we don't see that, and there can be silvicultural management techniques we can use, and I'll talk about those for increasing the abundance of seedlings and saplings. So the second, looking at the overstory trees, and these are things like, are there unhealthy looking trees, right? So these are trees maybe with really small crowns, like in these 2 photos to the left, are really close together. Trees of a similar size, or another common characteristic in our forests are just, not a lot of species present. And there's some forest types that have fewer species than others. But for resilience, we really want to think about, having as many species as that land naturally can hold, because that leaves us a lot more diversity. If we get an insect that comes in that attacks a certain species, or often, even things like windstorms really affect certain species more than others. So diversity is key. And, when we look at things like emerald ash borer, which is a photo in the middle, my old coworker peeling a tree, right? We know that if we have a diversity of species in that stand, when a pest comes through, the end result will be less destructive. So we also want to look for any conditions of a forest that suggest that there is effect to soils and water quality. So these things like soil erosion or rutting, large areas of soil that's not covered in leaf litter. Leaf litter is a really good protector to soil. And another thing is things like lack of dead woods. This is dead, logs on the ground. We really want to see those in various stages of decay, maybe even standing dead trees, logs on the ground, because that allows for nutrient cycling into the soil, also protects the soil, traps water. It does a lot of really important ecological functions. And we know that because of land use change, there's less deadwood in our forests than there would have been, pre-colonialization. It's another common site we see in a lot of our Vermont forests, just because of past land use. There might be old logging roads that were never really closed out in a proper way, and they've become a channel for water. So we get things like erosion. We might have areas like we see in this lower left where there's a culvert that's totally failed, right? So they're sort of common things, and it's really critical that we fix those, especially when we think about climate change and getting increased rainfall. So on this, the next set of these are sort of after you've done that work, are the techniques you can use when you've identified some of those vulnerabilities. So the first of these is slow spread and sink water. As I've mentioned, Vermont is getting more rain, often in stronger rain events. So we've experienced 9 inches of total precipitation increase since the late 1800s. But we are seeing more of that is coming in these punctuated events. And heavy rain can actually physically wash away this leaf litter, as I mentioned, causes erosion, nutrient losses, and certainly water quality issues. So we want to see something like the top image, where water is pooling, it's allowed to absorb in the forest, it's staying in the forest where it's most used. And we used to, one of the things we used to do is channelize water, try to move it as fast as possible from location. And we know now that's not the best thing. So, that idea of slow spread and sink as much as possible, especially if we have places like my land that has a lot of steep slopes, topographic effects. So thinking about depressions where we can get that water to lie. So on roads and trails, diverting water off the traveled surface is great because water wants to find the path of least resistance. So putting it into these depressions or flat areas where it can be absorbed. Certainly making sure any infrastructure you have on roads, trails, so like culverts, drainage, bridges, can accommodate big flows. And lots of people are doing this, is upsizing culverts for these extreme rainfall events. As I mentioned, deadwood is this amazing free thing we all have in our wood that we can actually use strategically to sort of physically stop water. So we can actually put logs down perpendicular to the slope to act as sort of a barrier. They trap leaf litter, twigs, and things like that, and slow down water. We also know that deadwood it retains water for a long period of time. It's like a sponge. And one thing that's really good to do, I do this a lot, is just walk in the woods, either if you're brave and got a lot of rain gear while it's raining, or immediately after raining, and you can see where the water has flowed and sort of identify these potential areas of erosion. So the next of this really ties into that is protecting soils and water. We know that climate change will bring more variability in the dynamics of soil water. I mentioned increased water and rainfall. We also know that just climate change itself will affect soil processes. And we're learning a lot about that all the time. But I will say it's much easier and cost effective to protect soils and water rather than trying to fix them after the fact. And we know that soils are really easily damaged, by things like heavy equipment, especially when they're wet. And the other thing that we're learning about is carbon. carbon in our forests, and we care about carbon in our forests because trees can take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which is a greenhouse gas, and they store that carbon not only in their trunks and their branches, but they help store it in soil. And in fact, in Vermont, when we look at in our forests, about 50% of the carbon in our forest is in the soil. So that's huge. And we want to keep that carbon where it is as long as we can. So what we can do, anytime we're doing work in the woods, and this can be if we're doing timber harvest, but also recreating, hiking trails, ATV trails, doing any sort of work, harvesting firewood, avoiding wet, mucky areas, selecting equipment with the smallest impact. There's a lot of great equipment now that has low pressure tires that are designed to minimize impact. Doing work either in the winter, if we have frozen ground and snow, which really helps protect the soil, or even times when we have really dry soil, that's a lot more protected than wet soil. Things like bridges, logs, or even branches laid down on the traveled surface can really do wonders to help protect the soil from compaction. So there's a lot of creative things we can do to reduce soil impact. And certainly, this is a big thing. I think, as all landowners, we need to identify, do we have old logging roads, old trails that maybe aren't in the best spot, aren't being used, and are just sources of erosion right now? We can do some simple things of creating water bars and sort of closing those out and preventing more damage. The other thing that is important to think about with soil and water is keeping vegetation in some of those steep slopes. So along waterways and wetlands, certainly, but anytime we have steep slopes, root systems do an incredible job about keeping the soil where it is. So the next of these, also really, really important, is thinking about the future forests, the regeneration. All forests need trees of different ages. We have a situation in our state and in our region where, because of past land use, the clearing of most of our forests for agriculture and then the subsequent abandonment of those farms, trees grew up, and it's a great story of resilience. We have amazing forest cover now, but that means we mostly have a single age class. That means most of our forests have one age of tree, or they're not very different in age. Sometimes we have forests where maybe there's two different age classes, but very few are what we call multi-age classes. And then we also have the stressor of heavy deer browse in recent years that has oftentimes, really limited that new age class coming in. And we have to remember too, for regeneration, we need sunlight and space for those new trees to occupy. So on many of our stands, just because of their developmental stage, trees are close together. We walk in the woods, there's not a lot of sunlight hitting the forest floor, so there's not a lot of opportunity for new trees to grow up and take space. So what we can do, there's a number of things we can do. Retaining like large, healthy trees we have in our woods that can be a source of seed. So we can do things like a crop tree release around those trees to allow some space for them to reproduce, because those trees, healthy big trees in our forests, are the survivors. They're the ones that have thrived. They have a good source of genetics. Keeping those in the woods is really beneficial. Creating gaps in the canopy, as I mentioned, many our species need room to grow and space. They need light. So we do need to create gaps, and it depends on which species you're trying to promote. Some species need bigger gaps depending on their light requirements. And some species even need certain conditions. For example, promoting yellow birch in our woods, they need to germinate on soil without a litter layer. So what we can do, thoughtfully, there may be places where you actually want to have what we call scarification of that soil. Like I said, very thoughtfully to promote the regeneration of yellow birch in certain areas. And in many places, we're having issues where we have competition from other species. So it might be invasive plants that are in your woods, or even American beech suckers. So this happens. American beech is a species that suffers from beech bark disease. And because of this disease, what it does is sends out root sprouts from its roots. And these root sprouts can grow really quickly because they're connected to this mother tree that's sort of dying. When what happens is they can outcompete all the other tree seedlings that are germinating from seeds. And what we see in some places, not everywhere, is just, what we call monoculture. So just a solid patch of these American beech suckers. And that means we won't get a lot of diversity. So you might have to do things. We do this in the woods of controlling some of those issues. I have that in my woods for sure. A lot of American beech with beech bark disease, and being thoughtful about where can I promote some other species regeneration in here. Certainly, if animal browse is an issue, there are things you can do using protection, fences, guards. Some people even hang Irish Springs soap to keep the deer away. That's supposed to work. And also thinking about increasing hunting pressure to reduce the deer population for the forest health. And there are folks that are interested in planting, particularly where maybe they don't have a lot of natural regeneration, or if they want to promote some certain species, especially those species that are future adapted. And I'll talk about that in a couple more steps of what that means. But I would say, seek out some advice about doing that. And we can talk about that at the end. But if you want advice about planting, reach out to a forester, one of the county foresters, or a consulting forester about where to get seedlings and how best to plant them. So next on this is what we call create complexity. So past land use has created more uniform and homogeneous forests in Vermont. Like I said, we're mostly a single age class. Some places we have only one species. We have in our forests, about 70% of our forests in Vermont are only between 60 and 100 years old because of this land use history. And we know from a lot of research that, just a reminder to, let's see if I can mute people's. Just gonna go through and mute a couple folks. Hopefully that works. Forests with more species and trees of many sizes, ages, conditions, including dead trees. We know that those systems are more resilient to climate change. So we sort of want a diversity of structure. It's sort of like the investment concept is, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. We want to have a diversity of conditions across our forests. And we know from past disturbances, we know from research that really sets us up for best success. This is actually an example of my town forest, example of a 1 acre patch cut put in to promote some new species coming in, also wildlife. I'll say, for reference, this in the left photo, there's this leaning tree to the right side of that photo. And if you look at the right photo, that's the same tree a few years later, and you can see there's all these new stems coming up. It's incredible bird diversity in here. Wildlife love this. And the species richness is incredible. And so we have this variety of conditions now in our forests because of this gap creation. Oops. So to create complexity, again, really important. If you're talking to a forester, foresters have a lot of knowledge about using techniques to sort of create complexity, number of species or more variation in your woods. One thing you can do is retaining large old dead trees in your forest, dead logs. You can even create some of these during a timber harvest. So analyzing the larger landscape can be really informative too. Are there similar or different conditions in adjacent areas to your property? Is it all mature old forest? Well, maybe it would be great to do a patch cut in your forest that is a stepping stone for some species that require that. So wildlife certainly, but even a stepping stone for seeds, for fungi, that all sorts of wildlife and animal and plants that require those conditions. Just creating that diversity is incredible. So thinking about the larger landscape is something that is really important when you're a landowner. Next on this, and that's the thread throughout of these, but increasing deadwood. As I mentioned, our land use history has created a situation where we have much less deadwood than we would sort of normally have, or we would have had in the pre-colonial setting, certainly less than old growth forests. And, we often have these conditions in our woods where we have these old trees left surrounded by a younger forest. And these can be downed dead trees, standing dead trees. They are critical for many wildlife species, certainly birds and animals that inhabit the cavities. But then we think about all the fungi, bacteria, insects that rely on these dead wood when they slowly decompose. So we know that they are really great to promote resilience. I mentioned the protection of soils that they provide, retaining water, cycling nutrients. Also, we know that dead wood on the ground, like smaller branches on the right image, do a lot to actually physically protect seedlings from animal browse. They're also a way, provide shelter and food sources for many organisms. There's many birds and mammals that require sort of a messy forest system for their habitat. So, where appropriate, as long as it's not, in the, along your roadways or trails, keep dead they are, as long as it's not a hazard. We can actually use forest management to increase deadwood, both standing and on the ground. So trees can actually be felled and left in place. There's many operators now that are pushing trees over with equipment, and it creates what we call tip up. So that's when the root stays attached and the root ball is sort of up in the air. Those are great wildlife habitat. There's birds that require that for nesting. Also creates great structure, or what we call girdled and left standing in place where it doesn't pose a hazard. And I've done this quite a bit on my land. It's just really you taking a chainsaw and cutting around the stem. You can do 2 cuts, and they slowly, the tree will slowly die. It can often take many years for the tree to die. And so you get sort of a situation where you have a delay in that dead wood over time. And so that's really important, is thinking about ways we can increase dead wood, not just small twigs. We want, big dead wood. We want different sizes and different conditions as much as possible. And the other thing is great if you have old trees in your woods, keeping them as what I call them future dead wood, right? Allow them to live their full life, and they'll slowly, branches will break. They might die standing, they might fall over and be down dead wood. The next of this is managing other stressors as we can. As I mentioned, our forests face other stressors besides climate change. We have European earthworms that are not native to our region. So earthworms are not native to Vermont. They're all introduced. And now we have more recently what we call the crazy snake worm. And there's lots of folks worried about this, right? I mentioned deer browse, certainly disturbance events like ice and wind and invasive species. And we can't, manage all of them, but we do know that climate change will make many of these stressors more impactful. So an example of this is hemlock woolly adelgid. We know that this is a pest of hemlock trees, and we have this in southern Vermont. It's really controlled by low temperatures. So we know, this is a graph from the Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation. When we have winters that are really, really cold, like, reaching -20, -25, we have 99, 97% mortality. When we have warm winters, we have a lot less mortality, and the population is able to survive. So we're worried as we have warmer winters of climate change, we might see this population surviving more, and we might see it creeping more north. So again, we can't control everything, but as best we can, promoting healthy, vigorous trees, certainly controlling or doing our best to eradicate, if possible, invasive plants. And I'd say if you have a big population of invasive plants, chipping away at the edges, preventing it from spreading as best you can. Monitoring and managing animal browse. Again, there are a number of strategies we can do, from controlling the animals from getting in to controlling their populations through hunting. I mentioned dead tree branches to protect young trees from animal browse. And certainly we know, just in general, this is true across the board, when we have a diversity of species, our forests withstand stressors much better. So if you have specific management concerns, we can talk about that at the end, but you can also talk to your forester if you have a specific pest or concern you're worried about. So the next of these is thinking about future adapted species. So we know that the future climate will be more stressful to trees adapted to what we call cold climates. Although I will say, a little caveat is that not all cold climate species will, suffer, and we'll see, won't see them in Vermont. We know that we have a lot of cold adapted species that are very abundant and grow across a range of sites. And so we know those species will have a greater ability to adapt because of this big population that they have. So I'll sort of illustrate what I mean by cold adapted species and then warm adapted species. So this example of what we call a cold adapted species, balsam fir, really exists in what I mentioned, those cold air drainages or up in higher elevation, mostly up in Maine. And this is showing the range of balsam fir on the left, and it does exist well up into Canada. There aren't color-coded squares there because, of course, we don't have data that we share across political boundaries, but it does exist in large quantities up in Canada, so very cold hardy. And the graph on the right just shows in the United States what its climate space looks like. So every location where balsam fir grows, if you take the average temperature of that location, the average precipitation, and you plot them here, that's what it looks like. And the sort of different colors are sort of its abundance with, orange, and I wish they put them a little bit, these colors a little bit sequentially, but really the darkest green is the highest, but we see a lot of pink and red, and that's a pretty high abundance. So this is the average temperature end of the 1800s. This is what the average temperature is now. And you can see, like, at the current locations of where balsam fir grows in the United States, we're sort of getting to the extent of its climate space. We don't see quite the same issue with precipitation. There's a wider range of precipitation that balsam fir can exist in. When we look at what we call warm adapted species, so this is an example of red oak, and you can see, again, its range in that sort of reddish brown color. It goes a little bit into Canada, but most of its range is actually south of us, well into the mid-Atlantic. And if we do this same exercise, you can see this climate space is much bigger. And if we look at the temperature in Vermont in 1895, we're actually sort of at the low end of its climate space. And red oak is not a big species in our state. It exists sort of in southern Vermont more than in northern Vermont. We look at the average temperature in 2021, and we're more solidly in the space. And that's why we think species like red oak will sort of do better in a changing climate. It's be more adapted to the future conditions than a species like balsam fir. Again, precipitation isn't as much of a limitation as we see temperature is. So when we look at what are projected to be these future adapted species, we can sort of break them into these three groups. So in sort of pinkish red on the left, we have the species that we think are sort of these cold loving species. And it's not that we're going to lose them throughout the landscape of Vermont, but that their suitable habitat will decline. So it'll be a little more stressful for them. They might not be as competitive. They might suffer a little bit more. And you can see there's a lot of our, really iconic species in Vermont that we love, including sugar maple. And I did put a little asterisk there because we do know sugar maple has such a big population, huge genetic variability exists throughout our state, that we do think sugar maple has high adaptability. So we might see some locations where it's suffering. We think it will be able to adapt in certain locations to the changing climate. The yellow is sort of the group that we don't think much is going to change for them. And then the green, notably a longer list, are the species we think will expand in Vermont. So these are maybe species we have in Vermont, but some of these are species we don't have a lot of in Vermont, and we think we might get more of. So they're species that might exist sort of in Massachusetts or southern Vermont that might expand. And I will say just a caveat here, and I put this, it does not include impacts from diseases and insects or other disturbances. So you'll notice species like ash are on here, and ash is suffering from emerald ash borer. So it's not taking that account. This is just focusing on sort of climate suitability. So we can favor trees that withstand a wide range of conditions, that tolerate disturbances in our site. For example, on warm sites, we can favor these warm adapted species like oaks, hickories, and pines. And in fact, we're already seeing a lot of these species increasing in our forest. So where I am, I'm seeing oaks coming up in the understory, hickories more frequently than what is in the overstory. On dry sites, there are more drought adapted species like oaks, pines that we can favor. But in general, if you have species that are well adapted to your site, that are vigorous and healthy, those are great to keep too, because they're adapted to that local site, So we're not just going to totally replace the species we have on the site with these species projected to do well. We just want to increase the diversity in our forests. And again, if you're sort of trying to think about this, I want to favor future adapted species. Talk to your forest, talk to a forester, a consulting forester, county forester, and I will point you to some resources at the end. The important thing too when we think about climate change is the rare, unique, or significant. We know that we face a biodiversity crisis in our world along with climate change. So this is because of habitat degradation or loss. And so, stepping back, the most important thing forest landowners can do is keep forests as forests. That is 100% the most critical thing you can do if you do nothing else. And so thinking about how you can do that in a legal way is really important. Whatever that means to you and your family. We know things like bird abundance has declined, bumblebees, and we're certainly losing forest land here in Vermont. So things like conservation plan easements, estate planning, talking to a lawyer, outlining your will, all sorts of things like that can be really critically important. There are resources if you need help with that. Thinking about ways to protect anything unique on your property. So rare or uncommon plants or certain like communities that you have, sort of special places. It might not even be rare in the state of Vermont, or it just might be really special on your property, and that's great to protect those spots. Wildlife habitat features that are being used, and certainly any wet spaces, so streams, seeps, wetlands, vernal pools are really critical that we protect. And we can do things, talking to a forester, getting resources, we can do things in our forests that have a nod towards improving wildlife habitat. So if you're considering you want to increase bird diversity, we have great resources on using thoughtful silviculture to increase habitat for many neotropical migrants. And the last of these, and really important, is monitoring and planning for the unexpected. So we know that climate change will bring more unexpected events. And as I mentioned, each forest has unique conditions that affect sort of the severity of that impact and also the future trajectory that will happen after that impact. So things like, this doesn't have to be, a spreadsheet really detailed, it can be a notebook, but sort of monitoring events. Our brains can sometimes make and really monitoring, writing it down, seasonal observations. Okay, we had a late spring frost. Okay, I had spongy moth outbreak. Maybe I, did management, and what are the management outcomes that precipitated. And we do know, as I've said multiple times, that when we have more species diversity, when we have more age diversity, that really can reduce the impact of an unexpected event. We have many examples of this throughout our landscape. If you have specific questions, talk to a forester. I'll point you to some resources, reach out. We have lots of resources in our state to help folks, better understand and manage their forests. And speaking of which, part of this project was creating these 12 steps for climate resilience in what we call these pocket cards, and actually just got these in the mail, and they're really awesome. I don't know if folks can see these, but these little pocket cards summarizes these 12 steps. You can walk out in the woods and look at them, kind of look at the drawings and sort of the tips throughout them. We also made a 12 steps flyer that has a little bit more detail and has resources for each one of these steps. And with Vermont Woodlands Association, I helped create this climate change resource center that we're adding to. It's sort of in development. We're putting resources on here for folks, for landowners to get more information. And in addition to these webinars, I'm doing some woods walks. We were going to have one tomorrow in Andover. Looks really rainy, so we're postponing that. But we do have another one on Saturday, the 15th, up in Wolcott. So if you're interested, reach out to Vermont Woodlands Association, or I have my email address on the next slide. I can help you get registered. But stay tuned to announcements from Vermont Woodlands Association on anything related to this project. And we do have time for questions. So I'm gonna stop sharing. And if you all have questions, we can discuss them. All right. Does anybody have any questions? See, there's a chat too. Oh, I said where am I? Where are I am based in I live in Bolton, Vermont, so sort of halfway between Burlington and Montpelier. Can I drop the link to the 12 steps document? I'm not sure the 12 steps document is up on the VWA website. I will get that to you. Stephanie, actually, who was facilitating this, had to step out for her kids, what do you call it, a teacher conference. She's not here. So we will follow up with all folks here with an email. And if you come to the Woods Walks, we'll give you the pocket cards. And we can also mail them to you. So yeah, you can always email me at my email address if, here, I'll pop that in the chat. And I'll put the VWA .edu. I'll put also the VWA climate. I'll put this in here because I think the full document should be on there. She's added that we had some last minute changes to it. Some of the URLs weren't correct, so we had to change that. So I'm not sure if it's up there right now, but it should be soon, and I'll check that. Any questions? And people can you can unmute if you want to. If you have questions specifically, you can drop them in the chat if you have questions. I have to say, these look, we had an illustrator from New Hampshire do illustrations and a graphic designer. I really like how they came out. Very, very happy.
So from what you were saying, it sounded like just encouraging diversity in itself is a pretty significant strategy towards helping things kind of get through climate impacts and different kind of stressors. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah, it is. And a big part of that is we sort of reduced a lot of the diversity in our stands because of land use history, right? So we have this sort of young forest that's grown up.
Yeah.
And so we just know, so it's example of, I give the example of sugar bushes. We're really encouraging folks that manage sugar bushes. Yes, we know that you're tapping maple trees, but having having conifers in your sugar bush really does help with the resilience. When you have things like a pest that comes in, that sugar maple, it sort of breaks up the forest. We know it provides a lot of ecological processes and a lot of things we probably don't understand fully, but we do know that diversity is really critical.
Yeah. And just want to follow up on when you were talking about, the downed messy limbs and branches, does that help protect against over deer browsing in those more open areas? Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, it does. And so folks are experimenting with that. My dog just jumped up on the table. Folks are experimenting with that, of using, sort of leaving limbs in there. So it's like a physical barrier. It sort of confuses the deer. That does seem to work. There's even some folks that are doing this on a sort of a larger scale around, like if you do a big clearing of actually sort of putting the limbs and stuff around the outer edge, so it prevents deer from coming in. It's sort of, it's not going to last forever because the smaller limbs break down pretty
Sure.
quickly, in a few years, but you hopefully give that tree, those seedlings and saplings, a few years that can get tall enough. Because we do
Yeah.
know, like, luckily deer browse ends up being sort of like under 3 or 4 feet. So if you can get them tall enough, it sort of sets them up for better success. Yeah. So
Mm.
it can be labor intensive, but it's a free
Yeah,
strategy.
yeah. Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes sense. Yeah,
Mhm.
thank you.
Yeah. And it also, as I mentioned, I'm a big proponent of down, dead wood. So it also provides
Mhm.
other benefits. You get that nutrient cycling and things like that. So
Yeah, bats and whatnot.
oh yeah, all sorts of stuff, fungi and bacteria. Um, Question: Are forest fires expected to increase in frequency and size? You know, that's a really hard one to answer because a lot of these data sets, it's even things like, are windstorms going to increase in frequency and extent? We don't have a lot of historical record on fires and wind, and because they're not that, for fires, they're not that common in our state. We have fires, they're generally not that big. What happens in our forests, we call our forests have been called asbestos forests because they don't burn very well. They're very wet. They have just species that don't burn. Well, we do get fires. It actually ends up being sort of the duff layer. So that litter layer, sort of the top of the soil burns and they sort of smolder. We could see a situation where we have more soil drying because of climate change. So things like, warmer temperatures just cause more water to evaporate from the soil and from surfaces. And so we could see potential for more fire conditions. And so, yes, we could certainly see that. We haven't seen it yet. There's no pattern in our fire data, but that's mostly because it's just not that it's hard to look at a pattern when we don't have a lot of data points. But that is a worry that we'd have. And then we do have some forest types in our state that are fire prone. So sites like with oak or with certain pines, we do have some of our forest types that actually require fire. So example, like red pine and pitch pine stands, that is a natural thing. But again, it'd be very small fires that would be part of those systems. So we don't know. It's something to be aware of. And I think it's going to be something that we're just going to have to keep watching out for, and certainly thinking about. A lot of fires, even places in the West, are often caused by campfires that get out of hand or power line. Usually human caused influences. I think that's going to be something we'll have to be mindful of when we have these really droughty conditions in our summers. Oh, okay. Question about, so referencing Eller Lake, Lake Champlain suffering from algal blooms, which is a big problem. And I think that does seem like a strong trend for that. I'm not, I'm not a water expert, but it does seem like that's happening more and more frequently. And there's, DEC and some other programs are monitoring, but not upland water areas. So do I know of a program to monitor upland watershed for climate changes for these bacterial blooms? Well, yeah, I think that's a big thing we're sort of, the community is sort of working on, is what is the effect of upland forests on downstream water quality. Oh, small lake. Okay, I'm not talking about Lake Champlain, but yes, it's happening across a lot of our lakes that we are seeing this. And it's often we can have discharge into our lakes that causes these so nutrient inputs into these lakes, but also just warmer waters. I don't know of any program that will help you with monitoring, but it is something, like I said, the community, sort of forest ecology, forestry community is looking at, with folks that study hydrology, is looking at, what is the impact. We have very we have steep terrain in our state where we have a lot of flow down into our water bodies where they sort of concentrate. And so it is something to be aware of. And that's, why I say every landowner sort of addressing those issues as best possible, because we have, a lot of different landowners, sort of small patchwork of landowners, doing what we all can to sort of hedge those bets and reduce erosion. I would say too, around your house, of things like how can you slow spread and sink water around your house instead of, we used, like I said, there was this idea to like get stuff off their driveway as fast as possible, channelize it. There's many examples around our country where we did this. We sort of ripped out dead wood from our stream and tried to make the water move as fast as possible. And now we're realizing, no, we need to slow it down. So there are ways you can do that. People are, installing like areas like seeps where they have sort of artificial wetland, or not artificial, but they recreate wetlands. We've seen this in some of our urban areas around parking lots. Instead of having that runoff from parking lots just go into a drain, have it go into a swale where there are plants and it can be absorbed. So, there's a lot of different things we can do and sort of if we add all those different actions up. Yes, and certainly beavers. Yes, thanks, Catherine. I am a huge supporter of beavers. If you haven't read Eager, which is an excellent book about beavers and their incredible capacity to, yes, slow and hold water and nutrients, they're incredible. Although, I will say in a lot of our terrain in Vermont, they just wouldn't be up in there. It's steep areas just doesn't really allow, there's not really the habitat for them to create a pond. And so, there are many places like that where we might see erosion issues that we can use, sort of like, think like a beaver, and use dead wood in sort of that similar aspect. Great. Well, it's 8 o'clock. Thanks everyone for attending. I appreciate it. Great questions, great interest. Yeah, and reach out to me if you have trouble finding anything, the 12 steps, or want more information. And again, yeah, VWA, it's a great resource for a lot of things, and we'll keep adding information there and hopefully doing more things like woods walks and webinars and different events like that. So everyone have a good night, and thank you all for your interest.